Hi, this is International Master David Pruess, and I'm here today to show you another interesting game that I saw recently in the Petrov defense. And as I said with the first of these games, which I showed, I'm not purporting here to provide you a systematic way to play against the Petrov. All I'm doing is sharing with you some interesting games that I saw, which I thought were interesting. They raised an eyebrow for me. I thought they were instructive, pretty, cool, that sort of thing. So I'm just sharing, and I hope you'll enjoy it, and you might also learn a couple things from my comments to the game. So the last game that we saw was Gashimov Gelfand, and that was a rather destructive and short game featuring the 3d4 move. Today's game is less overtly bloody. There's no knight takes g7 type of sacrifice in this game. But I think that this is actually the more beautiful game. And this one is really nice, in my opinion. So this is played in the Montreal International Tournament. The white player is Arkady Neidich, a very strong player from Germany. At the time, rated like 2697 FIDE, maybe now has just crossed 2700 FIDE, and he won that tournament. And his opponent playing black is young Canadian player Mark Blovstein, who's very talented, but at least 100 points lower rated than him. Mark, however, is a very big expert on the Petrov defense, at least, in my opinion. He's got a pretty high level in that opening. So, okay, this game here starts with knight takes e5, which is the main line, and that's one cool thing about these two games is that they're both in main lines, and one is in d4, one is in knight takes e5. Just makes it feel like, hey, maybe the Petrov is, not such a dead opening. Maybe it's still interesting, right? Okay, so d6 is the normal move. In case you don't know, knight takes e4, queen e2 is quite bad for black. I'm not going to go over that opening trap right now. So the normal point of the Petrov is first you chase the knight back with d6, then you recapture your pawn. Now the move queen e2 is harmless after queen e7, defending the knight. And this is how a lot of games have ended in draws with this queen trade here. So if you're playing a game that you need to win as black, that's a pretty tough position for black to win, as far as I know. So the Petrov might not be your best choice. But anyway, most people know that when they play the Petrov. White plays d4 here. And you can also play d3, knight f6, d4 for white. That's less ambitious, and you get an exchange French type of position. So instead of just chasing that knight back, white's going to play d4, d5, and in this line, they're going to try and put some pressure on these two squares here. If they force black to retreat the knight from e4 to f6, then white will be one tempo up compared to positions you might get from an exchange French. We'll see an example of that coming up in this game. So bishop to d3, bishop to d6. I think also very common main line, bishop to e7 or knight to c6 for black. But bishop d6 is a perfectly common move. Castles, castles, c4. So here you see white starting to put pressure on the d5 square. And black will play c6 to defend d5 and e4. And white plays rook to e1. And so here, for example, white's attacking this knight on e4, threatening to win a pawn, although they would have to trade off a pretty good light squared bishop to do that. If black retreated like this, then basically white would have an extra tempo compared to some exchange French type positions. You can basically see that that's this extra move of the rook already being on e1 instead of being on f1. And so you can follow up with knight c3 or bishop to g5 here, and probably get some promising or some chances for white, although black's also still pretty solid. But rook to e1 is, a strong and useful extra move to have in hand for white. So after rook to e1, black played bishop to f5, defending the e4 square. And here, to make progress, white's going to have to add this knight on b1 to the fight for these two squares. But how they do that, they have two different options at least. Actually, there's a third option other than doing that, which is attacking the same squares with your queen also, right? So actually there's more than one option. But principally, you could either trade on d5 and then advance knight c3, which is what happened in the game we will pursue. Or you could just play knight c3 right away, which would lead to knight takes knight, pawn takes knight. Notice that once white plays knight to c3 in their fight for e4, black can now deal with the knight on e4 without losing a tempo with something like knight f6. And yes, I know, hanging the piece. No longer an option. So knight takes knight, pawn takes knight. So now I think something like this is likely. And when you get to this position and look at it, you could try to make some evaluation here. I think this position has been played before. Well, I know this position has been played before in Grandmaster practice. It looks like a typical opening position to me in terms of evaluation. The balance is black has 2 pawn islands and white has 3. That means that these white pawns on the queen side being split up is a slight disadvantage. But on the other hand, white has a good pawn in the center here on d4, and that gives him a little extra central space. And additionally, white is ahead 1.5 tempi in development, which is another, tiny little bit of juice for white here. So overall, perhaps a slight advantage for white, but very solid for black. Positionally, he's got a solid pawn structure, a good square for his dark squared bishop, and he can play knight d7 to b6 or f6 there. So, I mean, personally, I don't think this position is particularly impressive for white. I think that the way Knight played in this game might be a little more interesting. But let me also mention this move queen to b3, because this is a move that a lot of strong players have played here before. And white's queen adds to the pressure on d5. It also attacks b7. In this case, I think at least one game between really strong players went knight to a6, and after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. You can't take this pawn. I hope you see why. You can pause your videos if you don't want me to show you and you want to guess. That would win your queen because of check. And also queen takes b7 is bad because of knight to b4, which attacks your knight but also sort of traps in your queen and threatens rook to b8. So this is not very promising for white. So basically, once you reach this position, now white can't actually take either of those pawns, and they need to keep playing in some other way. So, okay, bishop to f5 in the game, and now knight is traded on d5 and followed with knight to c3. So he's threatening to win a pawn on d5 or on e4. That doesn't give black a lot of choices. Okay, now you have these two bishops facing off with each other in competition for a really good diagonal. And white having 2 pawns in the center on dark squares and black 1 pawn in the center on a light square, who would usually be happy about trading these pieces? The correct answer was black. And in this case, in fact, black did just trade on d3 right away. But as I said with the game I showed you last time, I don't think these games necessarily theoretically do serious damage to the Petrov or, refute any main lines, because I think black has improvements available in both games. So what do you think would be the best move for black here? Let me ask you. Should they trade on d3? Should they keep the bishop by playing bishop g4? Is there something else they can do? All right, so for those who care, for example, anyone playing the Petrov as black, I would suggest to you briefly a little improvement on Mark's play here, which is queen to d7, supporting the bishop on f5. For anyone who's seen my development videos, you will know that this transaction of bishop takes d3, queen takes d3 wins 1 development tempo for white, compared to a move like queen to d7. Additionally, I have a principle which I come back to often, although it's never made it into one of my video lectures, which is when you have pieces facing off like this, what you would usually like is you would like your opponent to trade your piece, not you to trade your opponent's piece. This is an extremely important principle, and it's one of the reasons why you'll see that good players keep the tension a lot more often than weaker players. And basically it's simple. Like, after I make this trade and you recapture here, how do you feel about the placement of your queen on d3? Well, I think it's safe to say that you'd be quite happy with this queen placement. She looks quite fine here. And given that we've already said that these two bishops are fighting over an important diagonal, doesn't it make sense that not only is whether or not to trade at stake, but also who at the end will control that diagonal? Compare that to this move, queen to d7, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. Now look at the placement of the two queens. Well, I think it's going to be clear to absolutely everyone that this favors black more than that other variation, right? Because now the black queen has possession of that important diagonal and seems to be on a nice active square. Okay, so that's the improvement that I would suggest for black to play this line. But in any case, they traded on d3, queen takes back on d3, and now they develop the knight to c6. And here again, there's an important alternative for black, which is that they could play knight to d7. This knight could then either go to f6 to cover the king side, or to b6 to block the b file and control the two important squares on d5 and c4. Knight to d7 has definitely been played before. I found a game in my database with that move, in which black seemed to be fine. In this game, black goes knight c6. Now this could also use the c4 square by going knight a5, and makes it flexible for black to put their pawn on b6 if they want to block the b file. But it doesn't have that option of going to d7 to defend the king side. I mean, from d7 to f6 to defend the king side, sorry. So this was played in the game, and now here I wonder, what should white do? When I was first looking at this game, I saw this position, I thought, looks like a normal position. Nothing special, nothing's going on. You know, the development is really close to being balanced. I think that white has, 1.5 tempi of development, because they've got one extra move right now, and it's their turn. But I really liked how black had this pawn on a light square with the light squared bishops exchanged, and I thought that they had good prospects with their dark squared bishop being such a nice piece. However, Ǩīģiņš had prepared, and again, I think both these nice games I'm showing have a heavy preparation component. Ǩīģiņš had prepared a very strong concrete idea for white here. So what would you do for white? You can pause your clock. Sorry, you could never pause your clock if you were playing. You can pause your video, however, and try and come up with an idea for white. Now I'm going to start giving hints. So first of all, you want to try and take advantage of the absence of pieces on the black king side to try and generate some weaknesses in black's camp. An interesting move, which is not the correct move, is rook to b1. This is a move you should always consider because it improves your rook and makes the threat on b7. So often you'll play rook to b1 for free and your opponent will have to play some move to defend that pawn. Here, however, I think black would defend the pawn with queen to d7, which is a nice natural developing move, and which starts to take control of some of these light squares, which I think are important. And I don't believe white will achieve much with rook to b1. So what Ǩīģiņš did in the game was he played knight to g5, probing for weaknesses on the black king side. But this is only good if you foresee what white will do a couple moves down the road. So black plays g6. The next follow-up move for white is not so hard to find, queen to h3, prompting black to make more weaknesses by attacking the h-pawn. So it has to come forward to be defended. Now, if you had nothing special to do here other than bringing your knight back to f3, and then playing moves like rook to b1 and bishop to g5. It would be a good thing still that you provoke some weaknesses in black's king side. However, these weaknesses wouldn't be super terrifying for black. I think black could achieve a fine game here, and probably if I were black, I would just play queen c8, because with queens off the board, the weaknesses around the king will be less of a problem. And if you try to avoid that queen trade, I'm probably wanting to play something like queen g4, trying to press my point that I want queens off the board. And black should be fine in these positions, I think. So what was white's intended follow-up? Why have they played these two probing moves? Do they have any follow-up in mind? And they do. So here's the move played. With all these moves, you can pause the video if you want to try and test yourself. G4. Now this move strikes at black and doesn't give black a lot of choices, because there's a huge threat of taking on h5, winning a pawn and really creating some problems for black's king, opening him up. But black has what looks like a really obvious defense available, and you should have taken that into account. Knight at Chad. And don't you think you should be able to play as well as he can? Queen to d7. This seems to shut down white's attack immediately. And in fact, it does achieve a queen trade. So white just takes on h5 calmly. Black trades the queens off. And then black takes the pawn back. But in this position here, actually, like what white's done is rather interesting. They've managed to open up the position a little bit. The h5 pawn is much more of a weakness with that pawn trade in. And notice that white still has half a tempo of extra development, right? 2 pieces versus 2 pieces, and it's white's move. Well, opening up the position favors somebody with a lead in development. Now, white's lead in development is extremely slim, but take into account that he can almost always win another tempo of development with rook to b1. And because, the threat to win a pawn will probably force black to play a move that isn't really developing. White can actually hope to nurse a slight development lead into a little bit of an initiative here if possible. And being able to target this pawn on h5 will definitely help with that. In fact, I would suggest another possible improvement for black here, that they just sacrifice a pawn in this position instead of taking back on h5. I think that black still has reasonable chances to defend this endgame if they just play rook to e8, giving up a pawn, and then, for example, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, pawn takes g6. Black can reach this endgame here, and I don't think that they would be in big danger in this endgame. For example, something like this, and their rook is actively placed. I don't know. To me, this certainly seems like you would have chances to defend an endgame like this, just down a pawn, but with your structure pretty healthy. But in the game, of course, black plays the natural recapture, and things start to get really bad quickly now. So first of all, what should you do next for white? Not a very, very hard move. You improve the rook and force black to choose between rook to b8, b6, knight to a5. In this position, knight to a5 doesn't look like a great option, probably because of rook to b5, attacking the knight, and after the knight is defended, rook takes d5, and black is starting to drop too much in terms of pawns. Rook to b8 would also have been possible, and might have actually developed somewhat similar to the game. I think that move is possible, but doesn't change things too much. Black plays the most natural move, pawn to b6, which leaves the rook on a8 free to come to d8 or e8 at some point, or even c8, right? And defends a5 in case the knight wants to come to a5 at some point. And now here is the really hard to predict move, and really a beautiful move in this game. White now plays king to h1. And this move has the idea of switching the rook to g1, making use of that file that you've opened, and then probably where you're going to put the rook is on g5, attacking black's weak pawns. And that's more effective, by the way, than committing your rook to b5 here. The pawn on d5 can be defended by rook to d8 or knight to e7. And basically, you commit your rook here a little bit, but it's not actually getting through, so it's only making the single threat, which is being defended at the moment. Black can also try and defend that pawn indirectly with rook d8, again, because rook takes d5 fails to what move? Very good. I'm just assuming you guys got it and praising you. So king to h1 is a really, really nice move. It has the possibility of going to g5 to attack pawns. It also has certain possibilities of creating actually an attack against black's king. For example, rook to e8, rook check, king to h8. Now, you could play rook to g5. You might also consider playing knight to g5 or playing bishop to h6. You know, white has various aggressive options here. And then on rook to g8, now maybe I play knight to g5. And it could be even stronger. So, or if the king came this way, white would, of course, throw in this bishop h6 check. Now the king gets in the way of his rooks, and he's out in the middle of the board. And definitely, you can make some threats against the king in the center of the board with the number of active pieces white has here. I know they don't have a queen, but 2 rooks, bishop, and knight, I don't think that they'll checkmate, but they'll definitely be able to make threats that are uncomfortable for the black king. All right, so in the game, black defended the important g5 square from the white rook by playing f6. He also gave his king a route to a really safe square, right? Because none of the other squares we're looking at for the king are very secure. f8, h8, h7, none of those squares are permanent homes for the king. But actually, if the king comes to f7, that looks like a really safe and comfortable square for him. So black plays f6, and white continues with his initiative. So he brings the rook into this weakness on e6 that was created when black tried to defend the weakness on g5. And again, you see the principle of weakness begets weakness. So black's pieces are lined up, not a lot of options here. You got to defend the bishop. Rook fd8 at least drops your f6. So rook ad8 was played. And now white plays bishop to f4, finally developing that bishop on f4. But also really making great use of that knight that landed on h3 after that sequence with the queen trade on h3. And the interesting thing is that white's knight went from f3 to g5 to h3 and now tries to come to f4. Very often, a knight on f3 would not be very useful in this pawn structure. Basically, the knight on f3, see, normally you wouldn't play knight g5, knight h3 in this opening. Your knight was on f3. That's where it would normally be in this variation. The knight on f3 can't attack black's one common weakness on d5. But this knight on h3 is actually trying to find a way to f4, and among other things, it'll attack that pawn on d5. So actually, very often, let me go back to just show you what a normal position might look like if white didn't play all these fancy moves. So let's go back here, and let's say we played like just some normal moves, rook to b1, queen to d7, bishop g5. Very common for black to put a pawn on f6 to cover the e5 possible outpost for the knight, and then play rook to e8 like this. And this is where I mean like the knight can't really put any pressure on the d5 pawn, and black's position is overall pretty healthy here. But when black puts a pawn on f6, what would you normally want to do with your knight on f3? You would normally want to reposition it. It's not well placed compared to that pawn now. So you'd often see some lengthy maneuvers to try and bring the knight to a better square, such as knight to h4, knight f5, That's one decent square. Or knight to e1, knight to d3, knight to f4. Another better square from which you would attack the d5 pawn. So, returning to the game, you see that through an unusual maneuver involving this early queen trade, white's actually managing to aim their knight, without losing too much time, towards a really, really good square for it. So white plays bishop to f4. Again, black doesn't have a lot of choices because the knight on c6 is hanging. They can't play king f7 because of rook takes d6. So they just have to trade. White's knight recaptures, and there it is on that glorious square. And look how many weak points it's attacking. 2 pawns, which would be nice to capture, and 2 weak squares of black's. So everything just sort of works super perfectly for white here. And also, notice the value of the rook on the e file. Notice how that development tempo is proving to be really useful. Again, I'm going to flash back 8 moves and then, 8 move pairs and then flash forward 8 move pairs. So here we are at the beginning of the endgame. Look at the rook on e1. That's this development tempo that white played on move 9, rook to e1. And a lot of times people aren't sure how to evaluate that kind of development tempo. How much use is it? In this case, all penetration points seem easily covered by black on the e file. And it might feel like, hey, David keeps saying that white has this extra tempo of development with this rook to e1 move, but I just don't feel the power of that rook. I don't understand how that really matters that white got this move rook to e1 in the opening. But now we go forward 8 moves, and look what we're able to do with that rook. We got him into e6 when black had to play f6 at some point to defend the g5 square, most notably. And so now he comes into e6. He harasses, if I go back here, he harasses these 2 black pieces which are no longer defended or supported by pawns. Thank you, rook to b1, b6, right? He harasses those pieces from this penetration point. And in fact, now this knight is attacked and the knight is forced to move away further. Rook to c8 is an alternative, but in the game the knight gets moved away from c6. And now, you could even get to the 7th rank with your rook if you wanted to. So the rook's value on the e file is really coming to the fore in this case, but only because white really, played to take advantage of it and really knew what he was doing. So let's just take care of this alternative move for a moment. Rook to c8 is possible. White would just play knight takes d5, winning a pawn. Threatening knight takes f6, but also threatening a second threat. So for example, if you save this pawn, at the very least, I can accomplish my second threat. I hope some of you saw that. If black tries to defend this pawn, white can just take it like this, check, and now white's up a second pawn, and they're continuing to bother black. In this case here, I would be tempted. I know you 2 extra pawns is enough to win a game. You might say you just want to trade, but your rook is so active and his king is badly placed. I'd be really interested in playing this move, rook to d6, cutting his king off, an idea to continue with rook e1 and an attack. I don't know. Blame me for having bad endgame technique and then being the person giving you lessons. I'm sorry. I can only do so much, but that's what would intrigue me, and I would think that that would look promising for white. Alternatively, they could try and defend the pawn with king g7, but obviously after rook to g1, the king's defense is short-lived. He'll be pushed off that pawn, and white will win a second pawn here as well. And continue to have these very, very active rooks, which are really, really troublesome for black. Having your rooks that active, penetrating to the 6th and 7th ranks, controlling the open files, each of those factors is often worth a pawn in an endgame. So with 2 rooks like that, it's white's up 4 pawns in terms of how easy or hard it is to win that endgame. So black moved the knight away, and why don't you give yourselves one last quiz? How would you finish off this game for white here? how would you proceed? What's your plan for winning this game? And I'm just going straight along, so I won't wait. White plays rook to e7, and black actually resigned here. And the point is not to win the pawn on a7 or anything like that. The point is actually to checkmate black. At this point, white's pieces are so overwhelmingly active that you're actually, the correct answer to what should your plan be is, your plan should be to play for checkmate. The king's pawn cover has been forced to move up around him step by step. First, we made him play g6. Then we made him play h5. Then we played g4 when he couldn't take because of queen h7, and we traded pawns, opening the g-file. Then we threatened to use the g-file to penetrate to g5, forcing black to play f6. And then we penetrated to e6, using the move f6, having weakened the e6 square. And now the second rank was open. We finally get to the second rank, and black is finished here. For example, if you try and defend the second rank for black, check. King comes here to keep defending the rook. Check. A very nice move. Driving the king back onto the g-file. Discovered check. And this is the part that's really fun, when you get to set up really, really pretty positions. And when you get to do stuff like, spinning and turning, wheeling with the knights, right? Knight comes here. Knight comes back. That's lots of fun. I like that part of chess. And there's not much else you can suggest for black as a relevant defense other than rook to f7, right? I mean, white's obviously just dominating. On a move like king to h8, knight check, king here. You could take the extra rook. I would just play rook to g1 and wait for resignation. So that's all going well for white. So rook to e7, absolutely decisive, winning attack immediately for white with just those couple pieces. And I think this is really pretty, this game. Really beautiful concept from 𝐿 in that, like, every single move works together, and that he finds these subtle tiny weaknesses in black's camp, plus he uses his tiny little lead in development, and he milks every drop of initiative he can get out of those little advantages, and creates, a beautiful and actually pretty short victory. And I just think this is a beautiful game. Very, very natural stuff. And a very instructive game in terms of this concept of weakness begets weakness, right? Because just little by little, he forces one more little concession out of black, always using every little threat and initiative he has to keep improving his position. If I played a game like this, I would just be absolutely thrilled. And I hope that playing through this game with me will help inspire you to be able to play some games that look like this. All right. Till next time, have fun playing chess. This is International Master